Psalm 77 is our morning consideration, and we read responsively verses 10 through 13, but I want to consider the content really of the entire psalm, and I want us to consider it with this heading. And that is, when prayer doesn't work. When prayer doesn't work. And I love how the Lord orchestrated the song service to have a prayer emphasis. My favorite hymn on the topic of prayer was not just sang congregationally, but then played in the offertory, and that is, I Must Tell Jesus. And there have been many times in my Christian experience where I have been overwhelmed maybe with trial, overwhelmed with emotion, and I knew that the thing to do in that moment was summed up in the title of that hymn, I Must Tell Jesus. And so if you've been saved for a while, you relate to those things. But maybe additionally, you relate to this idea that Asaph is presenting to us. He basically says in the opening verses of Psalm 77 that he's at a point where he feels like prayer, it ain't working for him. And so what do you do when you get there emotionally? You get there mentally. You get there, really, I should say, spiritually, where you know prayer is the spiritual, God-honoring thing to do, and you know the verses, call unto me and I'll answer thee and show thee great and mighty things. It's Jeremiah 33:3, and you know James 5:16, that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, and you know that the Lord taught his disciples to pray in this manner. I mean, you know the privilege of prayer and the fact that we can, Hebrews tells us, come boldly into his throne. But what if you've claimed those promises and you've done all that, and it just doesn't feel like anything's any different? That's where Asaph is in Psalm 77. When prayer doesn't work, basically on our timetable, that's where he is in Psalm 77. It's not working on his timetable. And sometimes it doesn't work in the ways that we think it should. Prayer doesn't seem to be working because it hasn't immediately alleviated our crisis. And the words he uses here, he's saying prayer doesn't work. It isn't working for him anyways, because it's failing to comfort him in the midst of his crisis. And so that's what Asaph is communicating to us as he pens this song, this psalm. He himself is a musical individual. He writes it to the chief musician. And he alludes to some musical ideas in this musical psalm. And so this morning, with the Lord's help, I want us to consider these three ideas as we walk through these 20 verses. We'll consider, first of all, Asaph's cry. And then secondly, his consideration. Thirdly, then, and finally, his course of action. Okay, so Asaph's cry, his consideration, and then Asaph's course of action. Verses 1 through 4 give us Asaph's cry. And I use that word because it's right here in the text. You notice Psalm 77, verse number 1, Asaph says, I cried unto God with my voice. And then he says basically the same thing, even unto God with my voice. The Bible doesn't restate things with any sense of dereliction. There's always purpose behind it. There is emphasis to be noted here. It's like he's saying, I cried unto God with my voice, even unto God with my voice. Like I went to my Creator. I went to my Sustainer. I went to my Provider. He is my God. And yet, as you read through the rest of the psalm, you see this emotional instability. You basically see a nervous breakdown. As we walk through these verses, we kind of get to experience this with him. And what's interesting is, I love the end of verse number 1 of Psalm 77, where he says, He gave ear unto me. So I went to God with my voice, and Asaph is saying, and God heard me. He gave ear unto me. He has a sense that, yeah, I can call unto him and he'll answer me and show me great and mighty things. I mean, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man does avail much. I mean, I know that I should pray. I must tell Jesus. And I know that when I do pray, he does hear me. He's saying God is hearing him, and he knows that God is hearing him. And what's interesting is sometimes therein is our biggest problem. Because we know God is hearing us, and yet we're still in the middle of the calamity. Again, it goes to the point where he just feels like, I know God's hearing me, and yet I'm still in crisis. Prayer's not working for me. Notice what he says in verse number 2. He says, in the day of my trouble, I sought the Lord. It's like he's saying he's seeking God. He's praying to God in the midst of his trouble. And you say, Pastor Johnson, what is Asaph's trouble? What is it that's making him cry out to God? Well, we don't really know. You can read commentary on this. You could read Spurgeon's A Treasury of David. You could read Matthew Henry's notes. There's speculation in just about every commentary as to what his trouble is, but that's all speculation. I think one reason why so often the psalmist doesn't tell us exactly what the trouble is because you know what we would do. We would read their trouble and then compare it to our trouble. That's what we would do. And we'd be like, man, why are you crying? That ain't nothing. Look what I'm going through. But it's interesting. God is hearing him in the midst of his trouble, and he's doing the right thing by seeking the Lord. And he is seeking the Lord continually. Notice what it says, my sore ran in the night and ceased not. The idea of sore here is the idea of pain. I mean, his seeking of the Lord and the pain that is running with him through the night, both of those things are not ceasing. He is feeling the pain, but he is constantly seeking the Lord. And then what does he say? My soul refused to be comforted. Even though I'm doing the right thing, seeking the Lord, I'm finding no comfort. Again, it's as if his prayer life just doesn't seem to be working. Verse number 3 elaborates a little further. He says, I remembered God and was troubled. You'd think when he remembered God, he would then be comforted. But he says, no. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God, and instead of being comforted, I was troubled. And then what did he do? He says, I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. I mean, he started to think more about the negative circumstance. And yes, he's seeking God, but he's remembering God, but he is troubled and he's complaining, and that complaining only compounds the condition of his heart, the unstable condition of his heart, and that results in him feeling overwhelmed. And then a word that's not to be overlooked is in verse number 3, which is Selah. So after you got verses 1, 2, and 3 of Psalm 77, you need to pause. You need to meditate. You need to contemplate. You need to think about what the psalmist is communicating. You need to think about this kind of nervous breakdown, this emotional outpouring. You need to think about the cortisol levels that are ratcheting up because of the trouble that he's facing. Verse number 4, thou holdest mine eyes waking. I was so troubled that I could not speak. I pointed this out recently when I was preaching from Romans 8. I talked about how the Holy Spirit makes a groaning on behalf of the redeemed. And here's an individual who started out crying with his voice in verse number 1, but is now at a point in verse number 4 where I am so troubled that he cannot even speak. It's as if now all he can do is groan. And his eyes are being held open, or so it feels. He knows he needs to sleep. He understands the basic biological necessity of going to sleep for the rejuvenation of his physical body, but he can't do it. And he feels like God, with a divine hand, is holding his eyes open. Thou holdest mine eyes waking. You know how sometimes people will tell you in the midst of your trouble, hey man, just give it to the Lord in prayer and then go to sleep. Sounds good. It's good advice when you can do it. But if you've lived a little in the Christian life, we all know there's times where you just can't do it like that. He's telling us about one of those times. I've sought the Lord, I've cried unto God with my voice, and yet my soul just refused to be comforted. I can't sleep. My heart's broken. My mind is intimidated. All I can do is groan. That's his cry. Secondly, the consideration. It is unfolding for us here in verses 5 through 9. And I, again, just like I used the word cried from verse number 1, I'm using the word considered right out of the text. It's verse number 5. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. So he's considered his plight, the trouble. He's considered even the condition of his soul. His soul refuses to be comforted. But specifically in verse number 5, he's considering the days of old and the years of ancient times. And I call to remembrance my song in the night. I commune with mine own heart, and my spirit made diligent search. It's interesting here how his consideration is both biblical and personal. What he's saying when he says that he's considered the days of old and the years of ancient times, he's referring to what we would say is a biblical consideration. Like later in the psalm, he starts to talk about God delivering the Israelites from the bondage in Egypt and miraculously parting the Red Sea, which is, of course, Exodus 14, and he even alludes to a passage in Exodus 15. Like he's considering biblical things. He's considering God's, to use the idea in the text later in the passage, God's wonderful works, wondrous works from a biblical standpoint. But then he's also considering some things that are personal when he says in verse 6, I call to remembrance my song in the night. So those valley times in your life, he's going backwards a little bit, and he's thinking about previous valleys and previous times in those valleys where he had a song in the midst of that dark time, that night time in his life. Do you have songs like that? Would you think about those songs even right now? Because sometimes when your mind is so overwhelmed with the trouble you're facing, you can't think of the Bible verse. But for whatever reason, you can think of the song. We're blessed to have several musicians in our congregation and some guest musicians with us today. Some are songwriters, and some of those songs have ministered to people over many, many years. It's a remarkable thing, the power of music. Monty will preach tonight, but I remember when he was my song leader at the Calvary Baptist Christian School. And he was the youth pastor for a while under his twin brother, Mike. And Mike was the senior pastor. And Mark, because Mike's the senior pastor, he's doing most of the preaching. And Mark's doing most of the singing, leading us in singing. And we were in the chapel for the little Christian school. They called it the John R. Rice Room Chapel. And it was chapel time. And Monty would lead us, I think, week after week. Chapel was once a week after week, in all kinds of songs. And some songs that he would go back to over and over and over again are songs that ministered to me in the midst of my inner city upbringing, in the midst of some of the darkest troubles of my life, in the midst of my stepdad leaving my mom and leaving for jail, in the midst of just all the things that accompany the inner city, the poverty and the broken home and all that. I remember when I would come to that chapel and Monty would lead songs like, through my disappointment, strife and discontentment, I cast my every care on the Lord. No matter what obsession, pain, or deep depression, the chorus says, I'm standing on the solid rock. I remember how that would be kind of my song in the night. Or, blessed Jesus, hold my hand, and I need thee every hour. And with all the gusto that Monty has, he wakes up with that gusto, by the way. He really is a morning person, and it really annoys his wife. But anyhow, Pastor Monty, just lots of gusto, an early morning chapel, and he would lead us. And however many kids that were there had that many trials, that different ones were facing at different points in their lives. And uniquely, the Holy Spirit would customize, maybe not the preaching, hopefully the preaching, but so often the singing. Customize it to minister to the specific needs of our heart. The psalmist is saying, yeah, I'm remembering what you've done in ancient times, God, but I'm also remembering how you've ministered to me through a song in the night in previous times when I was facing trouble. And so this is part of his consideration. He's considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I commune with mine own heart. Now, you know what I sense right there? A touch of the psalmist being passive-aggressive. A little bit of passive-aggressive from the psalmist right there. He says, I commune with my own heart. Because, God, I've been trying to commune with you, and I feel like it's a one-way street. So all I got left is what's in here, you know. I mean, I've cried out to you, and yet I don't feel like it's working. So I've communed with my own heart, and my spirit made diligent search. So when I looked into my heart and into my head, and I rehearsed the ancient times, and I rehearsed my song in the night, my diligent search, what did it do? It prompted questions. There's 6 of them listed in this text. And so his consideration continues, verse number 7, with these questions. Will the Lord cast off forever? Because that's how he feels in this nervous breakdown. He feels like the Lord has cast him off. And will he be favorable no more? And are you noticing the finality in all this? 3 times this idea of forever is mentioned. That's finality. That's the sense he has. 3 times specifically forever, but then maybe passively the idea of no more. It implies finality. Okay, verse number 7, will the Lord cast off forever? Will he be favorable basically forever? I mean, favorable to me no more? Will he treat me like this forever? Is his mercy clean gone forever? Doth his promise fail forevermore? His questioning continues, verse number 9, hath God forgotten to be gracious? Hath he in his anger shut up his tender mercies, Selah? And again, pause. Meditate. Contemplate. Think about these questions. What he's doing when he asks questions is he's admitting that there is an absence of knowledge. He wants to know some things. He wants to know, how long am I going to feel like this? Because I feel like I'm going to feel like this forever. It's very interesting, his consideration here. I think when I considered this text previously in correlation with Romans 8, I mentioned that it's like an epistemological crisis. There is an absence of knowledge here. And he really just wants to know how long all this stuff is going to last. These are his considerations, biblical and personal, and even inquisitive as he asks these questions. Then number 3, I want us to consider Asaph's course of action. His course of action. And really, it's described for us amazingly in verses 10 through 20. Verse number 10, and I said, this is my infirmity. And that's kind of a review statement for what we just saw in 1 through 9. My infirmity, I just described it. My anguish, my trouble, all the problems. I just described it and alluded to how I feel and indirectly what I'm going through. It's my infirmity. But then his course of action. But I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate also of all thy work and talk of thy doings. His course of action is basically a 3-step process that just unfolded right before us in those verses. So I'm saying when you feel like your prayer life is just hitting the ceiling and coming back and hitting you back on the head, you know. You feel like your prayer life is ineffective. You can quote the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, but it just doesn't feel like it's availing much. Asaph gives us a course of action. He gives us a light at the end of the dark tunnel. And what's happening too here is so interesting. Verse 10 begins to reveal the collision between his heart and his mind. What we see in 10 through 20 are his emotions now colliding with his beliefs. Okay? It's been very emotional so far. But he's like, yeah, but I believe some things about God. And I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High, and I will remember the works of the Lord, and surely I will remember thy wonders of old. His emotions and his beliefs are colliding, and what happens when they collide correctly is they will then produce some action. I will do this 3-step process. And it's because Asaph is saying, yes, I'm emotional, and yes, the crisis is real, and it really hurts, but my emotions are not in the driver's seat of my life. What I believe about who God is and who I am before that perfectly holy God, that information is going to inform my course of action. I am not going to let my emotions drive my life. That's what he's saying here. And this is not a condemnation of your emotion. God gave you your emotion. But it is a caution concerning letting your emotion dictate what you do with your life. Make sure what you know about who God is and about who you are is what's dictating why you do what you do in response to the trouble that you're facing. 3-step process. What is the process? He says, I will remember. Then he says, I will meditate. And his course of action, thirdly, is I will talk. That's what he does. Notice what he will remember. He says in verse 10, I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. And he's doing now what he kind of alluded to previously, when he previously said that he considered the days of old and the years of ancient times. And so now he's like whipping into that. And he's saying, I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. And remember this right hand idea. I think maybe a month or two ago I explained this in more detail than I will right now. But the symbolic nature of the right hand in this text is it's his strong hand. He's talking about how he has seen the strength of God in the past. It's not just his strong hand, but he's referring to his hand with a little bit more skill. If you're a right-handed person, usually your right arm is your stronger arm. Usually your right hand is your more skilled hand. If you're a left-handed person, then that may be true of you. But the Jewish idea, the common understanding was, right hand is strong side. Right hand is skilled side. Somebody very generously gave us a gift card to Nukes not that long ago. That's what it's called, right? Yeah. And my wife and I and Matthew Johnson, we went to Nukes and we ate and enjoyed food and fellowship. And then at one point, one of the three of us came. Andrew didn't get to go. I don't know where Andrew was. Where were you, Andrew? He's just having fun with his friends. That's what he's doing, probably. So here it is, the three of us. And one of the three of us comes up with this idea. Now, somebody ordered pizza. I don't know. It wasn't me, okay? Confess that to the Lord. Oh, it was for Andrew. It was a to-go pizza for Andrew. Okay. See, we love you, Bobby. We love you. Okay, so here's what we did. We wrote on his box. That's what we were doing. And we took turns, the three of us. I think Matt started it. Matt, with his right hand, wrote. He said to me, Father, give me a word. I'm going to write a word here on this box. And I don't remember the word. I think I came up with the word burger. So Matthew wrote in cursive burger. And then I wrote it. And then Britton wrote it. And then he wrote it with his left hand. Burger, and then I wrote it with my left hand, which, by the way, I had a motorcycle accident and I had wrist surgeries, and this one took longer to heal. My right hand, my strong hand, my skilled hand took longer to heal than my left hand did. So this one was out of the cast much before this one was out of the cast. Anyways, I started to learn a little bit how to write, how to have some skill with my left hand. There at the Nukes, we all wrote with our right hand the word burger, and then we all wrote with our left hand the word burger. And then we went to some random person, we interrupted their lunch, okay, to get them to be a judge. Whose handwriting was better, okay? And so we didn't tell them who was who. We knew who wrote what. And so who wrote with their right hand the word burger in cursive with the best penmanship? and then who wrote it with their left hand with the best penmanship. Do you want to rehearse the details? Who won what? I won everything. Did you hear that? Did you hear? Thank you for saying that. I don't know if that was really how it went, but you could say that and I'll take it, But yeah, okay. So I'm just saying this whole idea of right hand, left hand thing, it's the idea of strong hand or skilled hand. Those of you that are in sports, you know the difference between strong side and weak side. Strong side is usually ball side, and one of the first things you do if you're a basketball player is, if you're on defense, is figure out, is the guy I'm guarding right-handed or left-handed? You try to force him to his weak side. The psalmist is just saying, I have seen the strong arm of God. I have seen how skilled he is with that right arm. So he says, I will remember those times in the past where God showed me his strength. And I love how he calls him the Most High. And not only that, this idea of remembering continues. He says it 3 times in these 2 verses. He says in verse 11, I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember thy wonders of old. So that's what he's going to do. He's going to remember. But then the second part of the process is he's going to meditate. He says, I will meditate also of all thy work. And then he says, I'll talk of thy doing. So this idea of meditation. Somebody says, oh, Pastor Johnson, that's the same thing as remembering. You're kind of being redundant. Asaph is being redundant. No, he's not. It's one thing to remember. It's another thing to meditate. Like if I were to ask you about the Sermon on the Mount and you remembered it's in the New Testament and most famously in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. You remember that. But if you were then to spend a lot of time thinking about it, you'd start meditating on it. You'd start maybe thinking about the Beatitudes. And maybe you could rehearse a lot of those extemporaneously. Or maybe you'd go into the call to be salt and light in verses 13 through 16 of chapter 5. Maybe the explanation of Jesus being the fulfillment of the law there in Matthew 5, or Jesus' explanation about avoiding sinful anger in Matthew 5. And the whole crux of the Sermon on the Mount is it matters what's going on in your heart. If a man looks upon a woman and lusts after her already, he's committed adultery with her already in his heart. You could really start to talk and think and meditate a lot on the Sermon on the Mount. It's one thing to just kind of remember it. It's another thing to meditate on it. If you're in the midst of trouble, here's what you should do. You should remember the wonders of the Most High, but then you should meditate on those wonders. Spend some time thinking deeply about these many ways he has provided for you in the past. I'm telling you that if your present situation doesn't give you a reason to have hope, then you look to the past, because God has been faithful to you in the past, and in him there's hope. So you remember, and then you spend some time thinking, you meditate, and then he says, I will talk of thy doings. And I like how he's not just going to talk, he's going to first remember, and then he's going to meditate. So it's not just, pie in the sky kind of talk. It's thoughtful talk. It's reflective talk. It's talk rooted in something that is substantive, something that's deep. He's going to talk. And when should this 3-step process begin? When do you start taking this course of action? Well, it starts immediately in the text. That's what he does in 13 through 20. 13 through 20 is him remembering, and then him meditating, and then him talking about the wonders of God and the works of God. And so notice what he does in verse number 13. Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary. That could either be a reference to the temple or to the tabernacle. But then he says, who is so great a God as our God? If you have a Bible that gives you parallel passages, maybe it says Exodus 15:11 right there. Very likely Asaph is thinking about the song of Moses recorded in Exodus 15. Who is so great a God as our God? And so did you catch that? He's going to the past when Moses was reflecting on the greatness of God, and it's ministering help to him right now. He's remembering and he's meditating, and now he's talking about God's greatness in the past. And he continues to do that in verse number 14. Thou art the God that doest wonders. Thou hast declared thy strength among thy people. Thou hast with thine arm redeemed thy people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph, Selah. I think the reason that the Selah is there is because he wants you to pause and think about the many, many, many times that God has redeemed his people. But then he goes into a specific time that God has redeemed his people. In 16 through 20, he talks more here about God delivering the Israelites from Egyptian bondage through the parting of the Red Sea. And notice this is so incredible. As he's thinking about the power of God, he says, the waters saw thee, O God. The waters saw thee, they were afraid. The depths also were troubled. What an interesting thing to say. The God who spoke the world into existence and who created those waters, Asaph says that those waters were afraid of him. He saw the waters, O God. The waters saw thee, and they were afraid, and the depths were also troubled. And then notice this, verse number 17, the clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound, thine arrows also went abroad. And here's something else that's interesting. One commentator pointed this out. I thought it was very thought-provoking. If you go back and read Exodus 14, a lot of the details that Asaph is recording here in Psalm 77 are not included in Exodus 14. So some people speculate that this is just some metaphorical ideas that reflect the strength of God. And other people, and I tend to be this kind of person, think that Asaph is just giving us additional information about the details that occurred there at the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, a thunderstorm is not specifically mentioned in Exodus 14, but Asaph is describing a thunderstorm. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. The arrows also went abroad. The arrows are very likely imagery that's portraying the lightning. And the voice of thy thunder was in heaven. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Now, I don't think Exodus 14 includes an earthquake, but Asaph is describing it here. And it's all really, again, a reflection of the Creator God's power over his creation. And it's a reflection of his power to help his people out of trouble. And in that account, he is punishing the Egyptians, and he is delivering the Israelites. In that passage, he's taking care of his people, and he is judging his people's enemies. It's powerful. The voice of thy thunder was in the heaven, the first heaven. Notice verse number 19. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. And then verse number 20, thou leddest thy people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Isn't that beautiful? Like, in verse number 20, there's divine guidance, but then there's also human guidance. God's the one leading his people like a flock by the hand, and it's by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Sometimes the way that God is going to comfort your soul, remember that's what's in view in this text, that originally his soul refused to be comforted. One way that God is going to comfort your soul is sometimes through the extensions of his comfort. I mean, he's the God of all comfort. And sometimes he sends people that love you into your life to remind you of biblical promises, to be an extension of his comfort. It's divine guidance and it's human guidance. So by way of conclusion, when prayer doesn't seem to be working, here's what I want you to know. It was working the whole time. He just didn't feel like it was. It was working the whole time, and eventually this self-willed soul was comforted. It was comforted. His soul was comforted by God's word. It's as if at some point he took his Bible. I mean, this is how we would do it in the 21st century. We're in the midst of calamity. What do? We're praying to God. It doesn't feel like he's answering. So if we persevere in our pursuit of God, then we go grab a copy of the Bible and we just start reading. I mean, it's as if he went and grabbed his Bible and he started thinking about Exodus 15 and Exodus 14. He started thinking about the ways that God had provided for his people in the past. And Asaph says, God, I know you've done it in the past, and so please do it for me in the present. And he is finding comfort in God's reputation as a provider. It was working the whole time. Eventually, again I say, this self-willed soul was comforted, and specifically it was comforted by God's word. It was comforted by Exodus 14 and 15. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I tell you, no matter what you're facing, as long as you have God's word, you're not cast off. That's the idea in verse number 7. As long as you have God's word, God is being favorable to you. Also an idea in verse number 7. You might feel like he's not being favorable to you, but open the Bible and you will then see that God has not forgotten to be gracious to you. Because this book is grace from cover to cover. None of us deserve the revelation of God through this precious book, and yet here we've got it. The prayer was actually working the whole time. And even though he went through a season where he didn't feel comforted, ultimately, God comforted him through the valleys of his life. Go ahead and stand with me, please, if you would.